Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Traversing the Stars podcast. How are my loyal listeners? Thank you for your continued support. And as always, hit the subscribe button, everybody. We have an amazing show for you all because joining the mothership is David Pepose. He's the writer of Savage Avengers from Marvel comic books. Like him, join me as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Pepose. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Totally my pleasure, sir. I'm really enjoying Savage Avengers, and I'm glad to be able to talk with you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for reading it, and thanks for your support.
Totally, sir. I always start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics, and who were your earliest influences?
Well, I've been a comics fan for as long as I can remember. I think my first comic was Amazing Spider-Man 347. That was right before Spidey and Venom wound up at the island together. So I remember that as a kid, and things like Infinity War #2. There was an issue of Captain America where he and Jack Frost teamed up against an ice serpent. An issue of Silver Surfer that Silver Surfer barely appeared in, but Adam Warlock was fighting Drax the Destroyer in the Soul Gem. Things like that. I remember having like a Batman book on tape. It was the Many Foes of Batman. It's killing me that I don't have the title right. The Untold Legend of the Batman. That's it. So just things like that. My mother was a comics fan. My grandfather was a comics fan. So I think I came by it honestly. I guess you asked what my influences are creatively. There's a few names. There's people like there's Devin Grayson, who her work on Batman Gotham Knights is like really kind of a Rosetta Stone for the way I approach things. Trying to make readers really feel something on top of being economical with the pacing and really trying to add in just as much action as I can. There's people like let's see. There's Dan Slott. I learned a lot about character from him. I actually took a writing class with Dan once upon a time, so he really was a big influence on me. People like Jeff Johns, I love his metaphor work. The way that he really kind of boils down a character into really their base component parts and is able to spin a story off that. The pacing of somebody like Rick Remender or Warren Ellis. There's so many writers out there, and I think part of where I come from is my critic was, or my background, I should say. I started as a critic. I was a DC Comics intern out of college right when the recession hit, and so there were no jobs, and so I wound up spending about a decade as the reviews editor over at Newsarama, and that really was like my comics boot camp. It really kind of taught me, not just to learn the lay of the land in terms of the industry. But also just to figure out, like, what do I like about comics? Like, how do I articulate that into my voice? What do I like? What don't I like? And it was sort of a really great way for me to kind of build up my own toolbox. If I saw something that another writer was doing that I really liked, I'd figure out a way to emulate that. And if I saw something, conversely, that I didn't love, I would really kind of go out of my way to try to avoid that and sort of learn from other people's mistakes on top of my own. So yeah, I'm still a Wednesday warrior. I'm reading everything I can every week because I feel like there's always something to learn. And that's what I like about working in the comics industry is there's always room to grow and there's always room to evolve and there's always ways to kind of shift gears, both project to project and even issue to issue.
So if I read correctly, you started off as a crime reporter before working in comics. Is that correct?
Yeah, I am. So like I said, when I graduated from college, it was there's the height of the recession. It was 2008. There were no jobs in the comics industry, and so while I was moonlighting over at Newsarama, my day job, or I guess I should say conversely, it was my night job. I covered crime and state politics for the Berkshire Eagle in Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
Very cool.
And it was a really it was a wonderful first gig. I worked nights. I usually would work from 3 o'clock till midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 in the morning, sometimes later. It really kind of taught me not to be afraid of a word count, not to be afraid of a deadline, to know that like if you have a deadline, you have to turn something in, and that is really kind of I think helped me in terms of my endurance as a writer. And that's something I'm still working on. But being able to know, like, okay, I can crank out a script every week. That's something that's sort of a professional level. And it's, if anything, it's a speed that I'm really looking to keep increasing with practice. But yeah, working at the Eagle was, it was a really, it was a big career move for me. While I'm not a journalist anymore, I still feel like I kind of have the soul of one. And I think that experience has really helped me out a lot in terms of the way that I've navigated my career.
So as you're writing these comic books, has any of the crimes that you covered sneaked its way into the comic book storylines?
Not yet. I guess there's like a little bit of the tone to it, because it was, I was in rural Massachusetts, and it was definitely, you could see the socioeconomic divide very clearly, especially during the height of the recession. It was sort of a lot of rich Northeasterners' summer homes next to really abject poverty, and sometimes just a couple blocks away from each other. And, I think that certainly probably colored a little bit of books like Spencer and Locke in particular. That was sort of my breakout book, and that was sort of a big kind of dark crime story. But I think really it just kind of, in certain ways, it sort of pushed me towards a creative career. I think I learned very quickly that I couldn't sustain in a journalistic field. It's just, especially, if it's one thing if you're covering like B2B,
Right.
consumer stuff. But I think when you are going towards the general readership, that is, there are a lot of people working very hard for very little money, and it wasn't the path for me. And I think that experience really kind of helped shove me in the creative direction. Because I just, I knew that there was probably another job out there that I'd probably be a little better suited at, and thank goodness I landed into it.
But that's pretty cool though. You had like a real comic book alter ego.
Yeah.
That's like the idea one comic book crime reporter.
Yeah, I certainly felt that way a lot. Where I would be, doing my night shift at the paper, and then I'd wake up and I'd either write some reviews for Newsarama or do some blog posts, or I'd work on scripts of my own. And so, yeah, it definitely was a little bit of a Clark Kent vibe. I did feel like I kind of had a little bit of a secret identity, where, I wasn't really talking about the other job to the other job.
Right.
But it all worked out in the end.
So when you're, sorry, I'm fascinated by the crime reporter stuff. So just to give you a minute. So when you're a crime reporter, are you dictating notes from someone? Are you investigating? Are you talking to police?
It's a little bit of everything. I one of the things that I would do is, every night we do the police calls. Every county had its own police station, and so you'd call every night and just be like, "Is there anything going on? Have there been any sort of major arrests? Have there been any accidents? Have there been any sort of natural disaster related things? Because there's a lot of flooding, there's a lot of snow related stuff." And then, sometimes, you'd pick something up either, in the court records. You'd be like, "That sounds interesting. Police didn't tell me about that." And you start kind of working your way backwards. And then, every so often you'd get tips, people would call in and they'd say, "Oh, well, I heard about such and such a thing." And so you'd kind of, you'd chase that down. And, I think it was interesting. I sometimes it was, gang related crime, the Bloods and the Crips, sort of our neck of the woods was kind of, it wasn't a hot spot like Boston. This was sort of almost like a finishing school, for up and coming gang members. But then otherwise you'd get like weird crime, like, there was a pair of teenage guard llamas that had been shot with bows and arrows. And I remember that being a very weird thing. And everything kind of in the middle. I think it's what happens when, like I said, the socioeconomic divide is so strong in a place like that, where you can see both, crime that's a little bit not organized crime as in the mafia, but like you can see more gang and drug related things, but you can also just see crimes of people, of just desperate people, and people who, you know, that their lives didn't have a way forward. And so that was something that was really, it was really tragic a lot of the time, and something that I still think about a lot when I approach a story.
And I think it's very cool too that you're a fellow New Englander. I'm Rhode Island, so it's pretty. So you're right around the corner.
Yeah. I mean, I will say I wasn't a native Northeasterner. I grew up in Missouri, and now I'm actually on the West Coast in Los Angeles. But I spent a good long time in the Northeast. You know, I went to college up there, and then worked at the Eagle for a while, and then lived in New York for 5 years, I think, before moving here. So I do miss it. The only thing I just don't miss the weather.
I totally agree with you, but I can't imagine that you're not destined to write a street level hero, like Gotham Knights or something like that one of these days, to show up your crime reporter skills.
Yeah. It would be, you know, it'd be super fun, and especially, you know, I'd love to tackle like a superhero street level thing. I think that's two great tastes that I have yet to kind of really put together in a big way, and so yeah, I'd be game for something like that for sure.
Now, going to we're gonna hit on Savage Avengers very soon. But the character of the Black Knight does seem to have a forensics background, things of that nature. Does some of that come from your knowledge from crime reporting, or is that something else?
Well, for me, so I don't know if forensics is necessarily the way that I would approach it. I mean, for me, it was just growing up. You know, I always thought it was very interesting, like the dichotomy of Dane Whitman. You know, I grew up as '90s trash, so you know, the photonic blade was something that, like, as soon as I asked for Black Knight, I was like, well, I get to use the photonic blade, right? That's what I have to do. And that really kind of fascinated me, was, you know, this character who all the iconography is this, you know, medieval, you know, archaic kind of stuff, but he's a scientist who's building his own photonic blades, and he's building, you know, his atomic steeds. And I thought that was like kind of cool. And but you know, it's funny. When you're putting a book together like this, you never really know how the characters are going to shake out. Like you can guess when you pitch it, and so you sort of have a little bit of an idea. But like, I've never been on a series as long as I have this one, where the characters really do start to kind of. It sounds like a cliche of them getting minds of their own, but you start finding like different ways to play them off each other. And Black Knight in particular. He was the character I was least certain about. He was the one that almost got cut. And my editor, Tom Brevoort, was very wise in saying, like, no, you should really keep him. You know, both he was in Eternals, which was coming out, you know, but also just, you know, he's the only one who's like who's been like a real Avenger. And so having that and the science background, he really does pop up in very unexpected places. I knew going in that I would love writing characters like Elektra or Flash Thompson, and I had already desperately wanted Cloak and Dagger because I had a lot of ideas for them. Black Knight I wasn't sure about, and now having written him for a while, I think he might be the character that like is the most me in this book. So I enjoy writing him tremendously, and I think it's that science background. You know, it kind of it's a little bit of a Swiss Army knife, you know. You know, like I wrote in a I think it was in this issue that just came out. You know, it's sometimes writing superhero comics. It's you find a solution in search of a problem.
Yeah.
And Black Knight really is kind of like a conduit for all sorts of different avenues of storytelling. And yeah, he's just a sweet guy who, you know, has a little bit of a depressive streak, and he's just trying to do the best he can. And I feel for him. I feel for Dane a lot.
Now, in your opinion, when you categorize a super team, and there seems to be kind of templates a lot of super teams have as far as their makeup, you know, the rogue, the straight man, the leader kind of thing. Sure. Is Dave Whitman the straight man of Savage Avengers? The kind of where the craziness around him seems to be Weapon H and some of those others. Is he the one that's kind of the Cyclops, the Captain America, the, you know, straight guy?
You know, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. He's certainly probably like the most normal guy on this team. You know, but the way I kind of viewed him, you know, I mean, my first approach for him was the tech guy. the Beast or the Donatello of, you want somebody when you're putting together a team, at least the way that I approach it is you try to think of like different roles that everybody plays. And so, somebody like Elektra, for example, is kind of like the team tactician. And then you've got somebody like Anti-Venom, who, usually is the stealth fighter. But the thing I like so much about Flash Thompson is you can kind of Hulk him up a little bit. If the symbiote goes sort of in the more traditional Venom mode, then he has two different modes that you can swap between, and that gives him some cool flexibility. Weapon H, for example, he was the bruiser. Of course, you want you want your team bruiser, but something that my editors and I discussed very early on was like, could I turn him into like a Swiss Army Hulk? Of sort of being able to, shift gears in his gamma frequency so he could channel the Harpy or Red Hulk or the Leader, or sort of dial H for Hulk in a way. And Cloak and Dagger, Dagger being sort of like both the team medic, but also like a little bit of a wild card in terms of the things she can do with her light constructs. And Cloak, obviously, he's the transport, but there's so many other things that he can do on top of that. He's also sort of the guy with the most reach, thanks to his prehensile cape. And then Dane is he's the tech guy. And so that was sort of the way that I kind of tried to approach this. And when I pitched the series, I thought, like, what are these kind of roles that each of these team members can be slotted in? And that's it so far has worked out really nicely, I think.
So when you have a team of this size, is continuity then a problem? Trying to figure out what's happening in the rest of Marvel for all these different characters to try to figure out what's going on, new with them, personality, powers, whatever, in this story like this.
No, I mean, some of that is by virtue of the way that this story has been, is that we do get to kind of dance between the raindrops a little bit in terms of continuity. But also, I don't think I have any illusions that, like, I picked characters that weren't getting a lot of love, Elektra as Daredevil notwithstanding, I think just about every other member of the team nobody really had any plans for them when I pitched them, and that was by design. You're able to sort of take your own spin on them a little bit. And you're able to kind of do things that you might not necessarily be able to do in a team book that's featuring all of the A-list characters. Because you kind of have to figure out, like, certain teams, like if I wrote the main Avengers line, I probably wouldn't be able to do something that would like deeply impact Tony Stark, because like Tony Stark has his own book, that we would have that an Avengers main book would have to reflect, or dance between the raindrops continuity wise. So I kind of lucked out in that regard, that I didn't need to really be digging in too deep in the continuity, but it depends really more on the characters that you're playing with and sort of how recently have they shown up. I feel like there are other characters who, if I was playing around with them, and I can say, for example, on Avengers Unlimited, when I worked on that was a little bit more, okay, I need to figure out like what's going on with certain characters right now. For example, like I said, I wanted to use Nick Fury, and I was told, well, you can use Nick Fury, but you need to know that like SHIELD is not operational right now. And it's like, okay, that's good to know. That's something I can kind of fold in. Knowing, I'm trying to think what else, what other characters, even small things like, remembering, for example, having, Carol Danvers, and I wanted to have her betting She-Hulk in a race, and then I quickly realized you can't say for Carol Danvers, first one to win buys drinks. She is somebody who's been an alcoholic. That's the sort of like, I think, fine details that you need to know. But as far as like recent continuity, it depends on the situation. But I have been very lucky as far as Savage Avengers is concerned, that I haven't had to get too deep into the weeds on it, because this story is kind of taking place outside of all the hustle and bustle going on in the 616.
is that why the story takes place so much in the Hyborean age, because you're trying to not get too involved in the
No,
main Marvel?
no, it's really the reverse. It's more of just a happy byproduct. I had pitched starting out. I said I wanted to do Conan versus the Terminator in the Hyborean age, and I said, having Deathlok would be a really great way to do that. The character already kind of exists, and we can. The great thing about a Deathlok is, that they had a life, they had a human life before being turned into a zombie cyborg, so they could be anybody, and so we could stack on extra cool powers like we wound up doing. And but no, I think it just wound up being just a happy byproduct that we're like, oh, okay, this is a time travel story, so we don't have to worry as much about, say, for example, where does this fit into what like Chip Zdarsky is doing with Daredevil? Saying, well, how can Elektra be here in New York when she's in the Hyborean age? Well, it's time travel. She's brought back whenever she needs to be brought back. So yeah, that it wasn't really by design, but it wound up working out really well for us.
Now, one thing that you always get with Avengers teams is measured against all the other Avenger teams. Not just in character, but obviously in power. How powerful all these characters, because they beat this other team. But when you're putting the team together, you think about who did you want. Was there a thought of how powerful you needed to make this team to measure up to other Avengers? Did the level of the team matter?
No, that's an easy question. No, for me, really, the only thing that mattered was just, does it fit the mandate? Like, if you put these characters together, would it like make sense as a Savage Avengers team? And yeah, beyond that, I think a lot about Al Ewing's Mighty Avengers. That was like a big kind of touchstone for this run, where when that came out, let's see, it was Luke Cage, the new Power Man, White Tiger. I think Jessica Jones and Iron Fist joined eventually. You had Superior Spider-Man for like 2 issues or 3 issues, and then you had Blade in a Halloween costume for a while, and then like Blue Marvel showed up. But like, when you start thinking of like Blue Marvel and Luke Cage and Power Man and White Tiger, like those are not like the most A-list of A-list characters. And I remember when I read it at first, you see it on paper and you're kind of like, I don't know about this, but then you read it and you're like, oh, like this is a cool character jam band piece. And so that was really the ethos I kind of brought to it. Like, it was never like, do I think these guys could beat Cap and Tony in a fight? Just because I didn't really know if we'd ever even get that opportunity for such a thing to happen. For me, it was just more of like, do these characters, is there a way that I can make them like play well together? And that I think I've done. I feel very proud of how we've approached that. These characters, most of them not really knowing each other very well, if at all. I think they've kind of bonded into like a fun little found family unit, of sort of all these characters that all have their own degree of angst and self-control issues. They're finding kindred spirits in one another. And I think that really kind of makes them a rough around the edges group that you really just want to give a hug.
So in reading the issues, it does seem like leadership is either going to be the Black Knight or Elektra. Is this something? Is there going to be a defined leader here, or are we going to, or they're going to be back and forth? Is it whatever the situation kind of calls for any given moment?
It is a little situational. I mean, I think the way that I've written it, I think Elektra probably defaults. Just she's I think a very tactical thinker, whereas I think Dane is a little bit more reserved and thoughtful. But I think that's the cool thing about a book like this is we try to make it a point that every character has a moment to step up. And sometimes I kind of twist myself into knots in the scripting stage to make sure, how does everybody get a moment? We don't want to ignore anybody in this cast. So, but it's also, finding ways to kind of, having a spotlight character, having Conan the Barbarian is kind of our spotlight, and having other characters waiting in the wings. I don't think this is a spoiler. We've already talked about it in our solicit copy. Like Punisher 2099 showing up in our second arc, as sort of a cool spotlight character. That's something that I hope to continue as long as the book continues. And I think beyond that, a strict hierarchy isn't as much my bag. I think it'll all kind of shake itself out in the reading experience.
So I read that Conan the Barbarian is leaving Marvel in 2023.
Mhm.
What was that something that you knew about before you entered Savage Avengers? Has that impacted your direction in any great way? And is that the reason behind the fate of Conan in a recent issue? I'm not going to give too many spoilers away.
No, it really is. I've known since pretty early on about everything with Conan, and that it was one of those things when the news came out. Really, the only surprise on my end was just that we were announcing it then versus like announcing it a couple months later than that. We all knew that this was coming, and it didn't really affect the way that I wrote my story at all. If anything, the only thing that for me was, no, it really didn't affect the way that I approached the story. If anything, the thing for me was just kind of recognizing, like, if our time is finite with Conan, to really make it count. And for me, I see it as such a privilege and a responsibility to do right by this character. Knowing that if Conan will be leaving Marvel soon, knowing that if I'm the last Savage Avengers writer to tackle Conan, what an honor that is. And so that is really, if anything, that might be the only way that it's kind of impacted it, is really made me kind of make sure to focus and make sure that like we're doing right by Conan, and that when it's time to give him his send off, that we do it in the absolute best way we can.
Did the plans for the send off, was that always intended in that first arc or no?
You'll have to read to find out. I don't want to spoil too many story points coming up. But suffice to say, my plans have not changed. I kind of, the way that I had written our story and the plans for this series, it was, I had even just not even knowing the situation at first, was just like, if we want to bring Conan back to his home, there are ways we can do this. So, when I found out pretty early on about everything with Conan, obviously writing this book. So it was a pretty, I can't even really call it too much of a pivot. It was very much like, okay, I had a bunch of options on the table, and now I knew, like, okay, these are the options I'm going to take.
So another cool character that has a pivotal role, as we already mentioned, is Deathlok.
Yeah.
He is, as you mentioned, the Terminator. He's a bit of the villain for a few issues, whatnot. Is he also being groomed to eventually become part of the team?
You'll have to read to find out. But I think anybody who has like any bit of sort of kayfabe when it comes to comics reading, like, you can probably guess. But all I can say is, we certainly did not introduce Deathlok lightly. Deathlok is going to be an integral part of the whole series for as long as I'm writing it. So we have a lot of plans, a lot of cool stuff coming. And I think readers are finally starting to see a little bit of the tip of the iceberg in our most recent issues. But we've got a lot of fun stuff coming, and I can't wait for readers to get to see all the stuff that we've had in the works for a very long time.
So when we're discussing continuity, there's a reveal of the identity of Deathlok, without going too many spoilers, that does impact a very popular character in Marvel. Is that then directing where his future, or is this one of those infinite universes, infinite possibilities? This is where he ends up.
I don't know if that's a question I want to answer.
Okay, fair enough.
I can certainly, well, you know what, it's a possible future, It's not necessarily the definitive future. The thing about the Deathlok army is these are multiversal characters. So they're built from the corpses of heroes from all across the multiverse. And so yeah, our Deathlok is one of them, and it was one of those things that we kind of had to think really hard about, like across the Marvel multiverse, like who makes sense, who first off will have an impact, that if people see this character, they'll be like, oh, I desperately need to know what happens. But also just from a story standpoint, things like, we're throwing a Deathlok on a regular vanilla Deathlok versus Conan the Barbarian. That feels like an even match. You throw in a whole team of Avengers and you really got to start stacking the deck. And so that was another big reason why we settled on the character that we did. You know what? I mean, look, this is going up when? Like in a couple of days?
Next week.
Next week. I'm fine spoiling this. I mean, it's been on the cover of issue 4. So Miles Morales is our Deathlok. And I thought a lot about that. I've been a huge fan of Miles for a long time. I reviewed his very first issue when it came out. So you can actually see me on the Miles Morales Wikipedia page. And I of course, a huge fan of the Spider-Verse, Into the Spider-Verse. And I was thinking, what kind of character has the kind of powers that you could go toe-to-toe with a whole team of Avengers? And I thought of Miles, and I was just like, he's got the invisibility, he's got the venom blasts, he's got the whole spider suite of powers. Imagine that kind of in the wrong hands. And suddenly that's somebody who could give a team of Avengers a run for their money. And so I remember pitching that to my editors, and they were, I was like, we'd be really careful with it. Like, I know how important Miles is to so many people. And the last thing I would ever want to do is kind of play with that legacy lightly, or in a way that felt exploitive, like my editors were really excited, and they were like, yeah, that sounds like a really great idea. And so we've been sort of seeding that in. I thought for sure somebody might have guessed it. Even in our first page, the very first page of the series is Deathlok with an invisibility cloak on. And everybody kept saying Predator, Predator, Predator. And yes, that was part of the influence. But I was also just, I wanted to make sure that we played fairly enough with our readers that like you could look back and be like, oh, he's got the cloak. Oh, he's got the venom blast. Oh, he's climbing a wall, literally climbing a wall in the second issue. Just for people to be like, oh, okay, I get it. It makes sense. And then to justify it in our fourth issue and really kind of give Miles this Miles lock, as it were, kind of the backstory and the heroic sacrifice that he deserves to really justify his place in the book and his place as a Deathlok.
Now, another cool character that was inserted into the series for a little while is Devil Dinosaur in issue number 2. Now, is this someone we can look forward to seeing again? Because I'm going to say a big angry red dinosaur, a T-Rex, is always freaking awesome. So, I mean, what's the deal? Going to see him again? Was that just a nice tip of the hat? What's up?
I think it was never say never, but as far at least as of this moment, that was just a tip of the hat. So much of this series has been figuring out like how do you cross-pollinate the modern Marvel universe with these other worlds, and the Hyborean Age. I had thought, we kind of decided pretty early on that the second issue would be the team split up and sort of dealing with all these different sides of the Hyborean Age. And of course, I felt like a gladiator pit felt so iconic, and having kind of like a giant beastie felt a little different than sort of the other sword and sorcery fare. And I remember thinking, I remember like thinking like, oh, like, what kind of monster could I use? And then I remember Devil Dinosaur, has been functionally immortal. He's been around for a very long time. And so I remember pitching, I emailed Tom while I was working on issue 2. And I said, hey, would it be cool if we did Devil Dinosaur as like the monster here? Like just showing that like he's had a long life, like before he met Lunella Lafayette, like maybe this is just like a hidden adventure in Devil Dinosaur's past. And I always appreciate when Tom lets me when he gives me the latitude to do these sorts of things. He always laughs a little when I when I give him these kind of weird continuity cuts. And yeah, he was like, yeah, go for it. He actually, it's funny, when I had first pitched it, he said the same thing you did. He's like, well, just like, can we have him out by the end of the first arc? And I was like, oh no, I'm just having him for like 2 scenes. This is a very packed book. I do not have room for a dinosaur in it. But yeah, it was a fun little hat tip, and that is something that I've been trying to do in this series, and you'll see as the series continues is any opportunity I have to kind of crowbar in some fun Marvel lore, I will do it, because that's like part of the fun of a book like this is like, yeah, you get the cool character dynamics and you get to see the characters play off each other, but it's also a little bit of a Where's Waldo kind of thing where you're like, I know that thing. That's a cool little like Easter egg for like the true believers.
Well,
and yeah.
Well, in every storyline, you should find a way to put Devil Dinosaur somewhere in the storyline. Some just appear somewhere in the background, whatever, running past the building or something.
You know, we'll see. I'm pretty deep into arc 2 already, but we'll see. Maybe in the future.
So, is it fair to say that the Savage Avengers are going to leave the Hyborean age eventually, or this is going to stay in that setting?
No, we'll be leaving. We actually just put out solicits for issue 6 fairly recently, and I imagine that issue 7 solicits will be dropping soon. But yes, we will be taking them elsewhere. This is kind of a road trip story in a way, and we will find out that no good deed goes unpunished. And that's kind of the main theme of our second arc.
So how fluid is the team membership on this team?
Well, the core members that you've seen so far, Elektra, Flash, Dane, Weapon H, and Cloak and Dagger, they will be parts of the book as long as I'm writing it. That was sort of what I considered the buy-in for me as a writer, but also for readers, is and a way to help us differentiate a little from Jerry Dugan's amazing initial run on Savage Avengers was, Jerry had he had kind of the first arc, which was a team up, with Wolverine and Elektra and Venom and Dr. Voodoo. But after that, it was sort of a Conan team up. It was sort of Conan bouncing his way through the Marvel universe, and he'd have an issue where he was teaming up with Rhino against Spider-Man, or he meets up with Emma Frost, or he had a couple issues where he was teaming up with Deadpool, that sort of thing. And then by the end, it was sort of a kind of a grab bag of heroes thrown together to deal with Kulan Goth. Thank you. So for me, I felt, even before we kind of knew about Conan, I said, I really want to have a stable team roster. So that way, there are plenty of people who will read this book because they love Conan, but there are plenty of people who have no affection for Conan, and I want them to have something that they can connect with emotionally to enjoy our book. So having those core 6 members, that means that's 6 opportunities for people to really enjoy this book. And now 7 really is as Miles sort of joins the orbit of this book. And but that said, that's the great thing about an Avengers title, and that's really kind of what I've felt about even with Conan. When he does depart, is the Avengers never rest on any one character's shoulders. That's the great part about them. You've got the original core lineup when Loki attacks. You've got Cap's kooky quartet. You've got when Monica Rambeau leads the team. You've got when Black Knight leads the team. You've got Mark Waid's sort of Avengers like champions kind of hybrid team. There's so many different iterations of the Avengers, and so while we will continue to have the core 7 as long as I'm writing this book, that's the cool thing about this team, is we are able to kind of shift in some new faces here and there, and you'll be seeing some new faces in arc 2 that I think are particularly fun to write, and will wind up saving the team in a major way.
Well, I'm gonna shill for a Beta Ray Bill at some point. If you can ever make room for Beta Ray Bill, please get him in. He's one of my favorite characters, and he's always extremely underused in the Marvel universe.
We talked about Beta Ray Bill at one point, and it's tough for the Thors, because you don't want to go too overpowered with a team like this, but never say never. I'll write this book as long as they'll have me. So if this book goes on long enough, who knows what kind of hammer time you might see.
So what can our listeners look forward to next in Savage Avengers?
Yeah. Well, we're going to be wrapping up our first arc next month. So I guess, let's see, it's August now. So in September, we'll be wrapping up our first arc. And then we've got some really fun stuff planned for arc 2 that begins in October. And it's sort of, it's an escalation of our first arc, but it's also kind of a massive genre shift. If Sword and Sorcery was kind of the tone of our first arc, post-apocalyptic sci-fi is kind of what informs arc 2. And like I said, it's about consequences. That's the thing about that. I think a book like Savage Avengers does really well is you can see that, the characters might win the battle, but that might mean that they've lost the war, or vice versa. And so kind of getting to see the fallout of their victory has been very fun. And yeah, like I said, we'll see some new faces, and seeing the characters in a whole new environment that's really gonna push them to the limit and beyond.
Well, that sounds awesome, Mr. Pepose, and I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I look forward to more Savage Avengers.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.